several thoughts are prompted by Michael's lively introduction to wake us all up here. One is with regard to language and how 20 years ago the term immigration reform basically was equivalent with immigration restriction. Now all of a sudden, not so all of a sudden, but over the last 20 years, the term has evolved or devolved to the point where when we hear comprehensive immigration reform, it suddenly means 2 million legal immigrants and amnesty for 13 or 35 million illegal immigrants. And it's a sign of how, at least on the language front, again, perhaps we're on the defensive here. Another thought raised by his talk is an incident that I had about 20 years ago, again, in Southern California. In fact, in the LA Coliseum, where the Olympics had been held, I think, once or twice, and where this particular event, a CONCACAF soccer event between Mexico and Honduras was underway, and I happened to be there because while I was in the Peace Corps in the late 1980s, I met, fell in love with, and later married in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a Honduran. And so that's why we're watching the CONCACAF Mexico-Honduras soccer battle, which I think Honduras actually went on to win. Unusual for them to beat Mexico. At any rate, here we are watching this, 50,000 fans in this massive coliseum, and all of a sudden, with all those people there, my wife just cowers. She says, God, I hope he doesn't see me. And what it was that about 10 rows down was somebody from her barrio in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, the capital of the country, who had committed murder in the barrio, and here he was now in my country. It's an example that affected me in a personal way of the sorts of things that Michael has dealt with for a long time. Not even being able to control as a sovereign country who gets in and who doesn't. And the irony, of course, with regard to soberanía nacional is that Latin American countries are very much in favor of that and yet don't seem to honor the right of these United States to exercise its own national sovereignty in terms of being able to decide who and how many come into our country. So important issues that were raised by your talk. Now I want to talk about yet another important issue this morning, one that environmentalists have wrestled with for a long time, at least since the time of the first Earth Day in 1970, when population was perhaps the major underlying focus of that Earth Day. And shortly thereafter, the Rockefeller Commission, appointed by President Nixon, issued a report on population growth and the American future, which urged the United States to stabilize its population as quickly as possible. This at a time when our numbers were approximately 204 million. We had just passed the 200 million mark. Now, over 115 million later, we're at 320 million, thereabouts. And most of this growth, as all of you in this room, I think, are aware, over the last 20 to 30 years has been driven by historic immigration rates. So, for some time, beginning in the 70s and 80s, some environmentalists on the cutting edge, at least I like to think, rather than the rear vanguard, or the rear guard, excuse me, advocated or began to wonder whether or not it would be a good idea to do an impact statement, an environmental impact statement, under the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970 on population growth rates, and then later on, as the immigration fraction of that growth became ever more the driving factor, to the point where it's about responsible for anywhere from 3/4 of the growth in any given year now to upwards of that amount or upwards of that percentage, and indeed, if you project far enough into the future, responsible for virtually all of our growth. So certain environmentalists began to wonder, well, maybe we ought to be doing an environmental impact statement under NEPA on immigration rates and what the long-term cumulative impacts of those immigration rates are on our nation's environment and prospects for sustainability. So this butterfly, by the way, was chosen for this slide because it's the mission blue butterfly in the San Francisco Bay Area, an endangered species, endangered precisely because of habitat loss and fragmentation as a result of the massive population growth and development that occurred in the Bay Area post-World War II. So this is the inside cover of an EIS that Progressives for Immigration Reform is working on right now, showing 3 very different population trajectories based entirely on differences in immigration levels. They all assume constant fertility rates of approximately replacement level of 2.1. But you can see at the lower end here, does this have
it has a pointer as well.
Which one is that? Here we have a population of 379 million, which is still, what, about 60 million above where we are right now, but at least you see it tapering off and then stabilizing. Over here, 524 million, that's at approximately current rates. And up here, if immigration reform, quote unquote, were to pass, we have something pushing up on 700 million, all by the year 2100. And there are people, none of us, I suspect, but certainly my children, I hope, may still be alive in the year 2100. At any rate, just to review a little demographic history of the United States now, 1790, when we had about 4 million, up to 2010, approximately the current time, you see that growth curve here, which has sort of the classic exponential form. That is, it's not a straight line. It's a curve with a slope that gets ever steeper. That refers to exponential growth. And in this case, it's varied anywhere from about 1 to 2% per year. 1% leads to a doubling time of 70 years, 2%, 35 years. And so this rate from 1790 with just 4 million to 2010, when we topped over 300 million, is an example of that exponential growth phenomenon that the late Al Bartlett used to talk about so much in the thousands of talks that he gave around this country and the world. Here you can see growth from the year 1900 to 2010 now. And this, with this particular projection, it's a little more of a straight line. Nevertheless, you can see that these increments tend to be getting larger and larger. And in fact, in recent decades, we have added on the order of 30 million people per decade. From 1990 to 2000, it was about 32 million, the largest single decade of increase in U.S. history. This last decade, from 2000 to 2010, I believe was 27 or 28 million, which was third largest in history, only after that 1990 to 2000 decade and the great baby boom decade of 1950 to 1960. And so at a time when if this country were truly interested in pursuing sustainability, we should be looking to top off or stabilize our numbers. In fact, they show no sign of that whatsoever and are increasing at a steady or even increasing rate. Not a very desirable situation, and one that has been called as undesirable by any number of presidential commissions, the most recent of which, now getting to be somewhat dated, unfortunately, was the 1996 report of President Clinton's Task Force on Population and Environment as part of his commission or committee on sustainability, inspired by the Rio Earth First or Earth Conference in 1992. That commission recommended that the U.S., the task force recommended, as did the commission later on, acting on the task force recommendations, that the U.S. face up to the fact that we had to lower immigration rates if we were going to achieve population stability and have any hope of ever attaining environmental sustainability. And indeed, we haven't gone in that direction at all. Now here you see the very varied rates of immigration into the United States from 1820 all the way up to 2010. And you can just see how, we've had several different waves of immigration that people like Roy Beck can speak to much better than I can. But we have what a number of folks call a pause from about the 1920s to the 1960s, before the 65 Act began to open up the gates very widely again. And now, in the last decade from 2000 to 2010, we had more immigrants ever than in our history. Indeed, it looks that way for 1990 to the 2000 as well. So that is what is driving this extraordinary population growth that we've seen over the last several decades. And as of this date, unfortunately, no sign of any relenting in those formidable rates. This graph here shows the number of immigrants in the country, both in absolute numbers and as a percentage of the population. And you can see again that it during that lull, it began to drop to a low point of, what is that, below 5% in about 1970. And now we're up to, 13% again, even higher because it keeps climbing every year, and more than 40 immigrants in the country. But that is not the major demographic effect. The major demographic effect is the long-term or downstream effects of children born to immigrants in this country. And my Honduran wife would be a good example. She and I had 2 children born in this country that wouldn't have been born here if she hadn't come into the country. Now, I probably would have married someone from this country, but nevertheless, there was me, myself, and I contributing to population growth in the United States. But at least it was only 2, not 5 or 13, something like that. So here we compare the United States to several other developed countries, all in Europe. From 1950 to 2010, we had a population increase in the USA of over 100%. That is more than a doubling, far greater than any of these European countries here. You can see Germany 19%, or Japan in this case, non-European, but a Western-style country, 52%. They had a big boom, which has now subsided. They're actually losing population. United Kingdom, 24%. They are now growing very rapidly. That has changed. The column there on the right, instead of saying 1950 to 2010, should say 1990 to 2010. So you can see that the USA in that recent 20-year period is again far and away more than twice as much percentage-wise as any other country there. And indeed, because we have far more numbers of people, the absolute numbers represented by that, the millions and millions, is that much greater. So what are the impacts of this population growth? One of them is on transportation in so many ways. I don't want to trivialize this, but when I used to sit in Southern California traffic jams, this reality was one that was very much in my face and in my nostrils, as I had to breathe the tailpipe emissions of thousands or millions of cars. More people, more cars, more traffic, more congestion and air pollution. Energy consumption. These are pumping jacks that I took a picture of on the Allegheny National Forest. One would think that this is protected land, but in this case, since the federal government does not own the subsurface rights, mineral companies, oil and gas companies had every right to go in there and start fracking those lands in the early 2000s in this case. There they are lined up on a road. There was an oil pad going in approximately at every 200 yards, each one having to require road and pipeline access. One of the concerns that wildlife biologists have in general about the assault on habitat that humanity represents for biodiversity and wildlife and wild flora and fauna is habitat fragmentation. So you can see how this contributes to that on a major scale again. Mountaintop removal of coal mining in the Appalachian Mountains, in this case West Virginia. One thing that I have talked a lot about, Jim Kunstler here has talked a lot about it, is the declining energy return and energy investment of a lot of our energy resources. We're scraping the bottom of the barrel, having to dig and drill deeper, having to go literally to the ends of the earth, all to get a declining amount of the fossil fuels that are there. And it is becoming increasingly difficult to power our society with that lower increment of energy that is left over, because it takes more energy to get the energy that is left. Unfortunately, there are vast quantities of it left, but it's more expensive economically and environmentally and physically, energetically, to get at that energy. I took this photo in western or central Montana, actually, near Great Falls, and believe it or not, a 500 megawatt coal-fired power plant was proposed for this location, wheat fields near the Missouri River. As a result of concern about climate change, the federal agency willing to provide a loan guarantee for it backed out, and what was built on this site instead was a 500 or maybe 300 megawatt natural gas powered plant, because the gas prices had come down because of all the fracking in recent years. There's a glut of gas on the market right now and prices have plummeted. The interesting thing about this site is that it's a National Historic Landmark associated with the Lewis and Clark expedition, or the Corps of Discovery, going around the 5 falls along the Missouri River at this point, the Great Falls that the town is named for. So we have at this very point right here, Big Sky country of Montana, a nice brand new shiny natural gas powered plant. But at least it's not coal with the much greater CO2 emissions that coal entails. Water supply, such as it is, we have managed to constrain or restrain the growth in water demand in the country by ever increasingly effective water conservation and efficiency measures. But nevertheless, there are a lot of aquatic systems, particularly in the Southwest and also in the South, that are under the gun, that are under threat right now. In the Southwest in particular, as a result of the drying out associated with climate change, and we're probably just beginning to seeing the beginning of a centuries-long trend at work here. This situation is becoming ever more commonplace. Here's a proposed water supply project in Utah. The Rio Grande in the Southwest, with a famous Will Rogers quote, the Rio Grande being the only river I ever saw that needed irrigation. But this is what they're up against in the Southwest. Even with ever-increasing water efficiency and water conservation measures, the amount of water available via natural processes is declining, and the population is exploding in this region. Housing and schooling, these are some of what I'm getting at here are some of the effects that endless population growth results in. This is in Hawaii. You can see natural habitat here being readied for a subdivision. And then the quality of life. Here's a traffic gridlock picture on the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York. These are all some of the issues that are raised by this endless population growth, fed by or driven more and more by immigration rates that refuse to recede because we don't have the power to make them recede against the special interests driving them upwards. So what a NEPA document does, what the National Environmental Policy Act encourages NEPA documents to do, is scoping, which PFIR did on this project a couple of years ago, and raised issues as a result of that scoping process. That is, folks who participated in it told us what they thought this EIS should cover. And as a result of that, this is what PFIR decided this EIS is going to be looking at. The impact of immigration-driven population growth on these factors right here. Urban sprawl and the loss of farmland, habitat loss and impacts on biodiversity, water demands and withdrawals from natural systems, CO2, carbon dioxide, that is, emissions, and the resultant climate change from those emissions, energy demands and the national security implications of those energy demands, and then the international ecological impact of U.S. immigration policies as a result of having ever greater numbers of high-consuming Americans. What will the impact be on global resources, environmental quality, the climate, et cetera? And just some of you who were here yesterday would have seen this slide that we showed as part of our presentation on a Numbers USA sprawl study. In all nearly 500 urbanized areas in the United States from 2000 to 2010, approximately 70% of the sprawl was due to population growth and not declining density, not increasing per capita land use. I also showed this slide yesterday. This is in one of those 6 areas that this EIS is covering, and this is if you project in a crude way, without considering possible feedback loops, as system scientists would call them, the acres of cropland per capita from 1982 to 2100, it is truly ominous. From nearly 2 acres per capita in 1982 down to less than half an acre per capita in the year 2100, if both the population growth trends continue and the cropland loss trends continue as they have in recent decades. Now, I'm not saying that these are going to continue, but this is where the path we're headed on will take us if we continue to stay on this path. So, as a result of the scoping that PFIR did a couple of years ago, it was decided that this EIS would look at three alternative immigration levels. One would be 250,000 annual net immigration, not shutting it off, not a moratorium, not zero immigration, but 250,000 net. That's subtracting the people who leave the country from the people who enter the country annually. And that's the proposed action, what PFIR would be proposing as the most desirable immigration future. It's the reduction alternative, as we call it, as the EIS calls it. The no action alternative, which NEPA dictates, National Environmental Policy Act dictates that every EIS have in there, tells you, all right, what will happen if we don't do anything at all? If we keep doing things the way they are right now, would be 1.25, 1.25 million annually. That's approximately what net immigration is at present. And then the expansion alternative, in keeping with the dreams of a lot of people who believe in either open borders or vastly expanded immigration rates for a variety of reasons, would add 1 million on top of that, 2.25 million annually. And that is actually not all that far off from what this so-called comprehensive immigration reform would lead to, at least in its initial years. What we then did was project those into the future, and that was that second slide that I showed you. Even lowering immigration by about 1 million a year still leads to substantial population growth in this country as a result of these demographic factors that are many, many years in the making. You don't turn around the Titanic or an oil tanker overnight in a matter of seconds. That's why we would still be shooting from about the 320 million at present to nearly 380 million, increase of about 60 million. The do-nothing alternative, the so-called no-action alternative, would see U.S. population by the year 2100 increase to over 500 million, over 500 million, on the heels of China and India. And then finally, the increase alternative, what the Zuckerbergs and the Gates presumably want, and many, many other very powerful people in this country, would be over 600 million, and as you can see, increasing at a very rapid rate with no end in sight by the year 2100. Now, this EIS isn't going to be looking at it, but we thought it would be useful to have the demographers take those trends even further to the year 2200, thinking in the really long term, sort of the 7 generations that environmentalists have often advocated, thinking in terms of what are the folks 7 generations now going to think of our actions today? And boy, they wouldn't think much of us if we could even get to this point. The low alternative, the reduction alternative, would actually lead to very, very stable numbers. What is that? Below 400 million. I think we'd still increase to 386 million. The do-nothing or no-action alternative would lead to 800 million. And the other one is not quite off the charts, but getting there, over 1 billion, approximately equal to what China and India have nowadays, 1.2, 1.3 billion by the year 2200. Now, again, demographers are the first to admit, and that they would never do projections this far ahead, but as an ecologist and an environmental scientist, I'm very much concerned about what the world will look like 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 5,000 years from now, as long as human beings are part of it and have to live in it. The EIS won't look at these projections that far ahead, but we thought it would be useful to at least show where these current trends and policies will take us. What the EIS continues to do then in Chapter 3 is the environmental analysis is look at the affected environment and environmental consequences implications of each of these 3 alternatives that have been put forth here. And we're not going to consider reaching tipping points or turning points. Indeed, and the great analogy there is putting straws on the back of the camel. Certainly, with the implications of something like peak oil and energy and climate issues in the world, adding population to those that we have here already could only exacerbate an already bad situation. But what this is going to assume, for the sake of being able to do anything at all, is that things are just going to get tighter, heavier, more squeezed. Thank you.